joined today by Kim Lyons, editor of the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Last week, President Joe Biden announced that he would be withdrawing from the 2024 presidential race. How does this announcement impact the rest of the election process?
How does it impact? It basically turns the entire election process on its head, right? It's completely a new game. I mean, Kamala Harris has not even been the expected Democratic nominee for president for a week yet, and there's already a lot of enthusiasm around it. There's a lot of local mobilizing happening. They're doing a big push this weekend across Pennsylvania, and I think it really has. I think in the short term, it's a lot more enthusiasm. There's a lot more. Democrats have raised some record amount of funding just in the first 24 hours. There's been a lot of sort of fundraising pushes online to get groups that hadn't previously, or people who hadn't previously really donated or been involved in donations. And I think the first 24 hours, something like 62%, like a really significant percentage of people who made donations were first-time donors. So that shows that there's at least a lot of excitement around Kamala Harris right now as she's sort of lining up support among state delegates and kind of, getting the key endorsements from within the party, which, today we heard, former President Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama gave their endorsement, which was kind of, one of the big ones that everyone's been waiting to see. So I think it's reset the race in a way no one could have predicted. I think a lot of people were, as you remember, were asking Joe Biden to consider dropping out after his debate performance. It was done very abruptly, very swiftly, or it felt that way to those of us who were sort of watching it. We were waiting around, and then everything happened all at once. And I think it's really reset the race in a way that I think we're still figuring out what it's going to look like going forward. I think both sides of the aisle are still kind of, okay, what does this mean? How are we going to do this? And how do we change our strategy? And I think they're still figuring all of that out, but definitely has a different energy to the race than it has for several months at least.
How does the president's withdrawal from the race impact Pennsylvania?
Well, so it impacts us in sort of an indirect way at the moment, but may become more direct. So if Kamala Harris, and she has commitments from enough delegates, right, to be we're not quite calling her the presumptive nominee yet, but the likely Democratic candidate. That'll be decided, obviously, at next month's Democratic National Convention. But, we've started this Veep stakes, right, where she's going to decide who is going to be her vice president. There's very many candidates, many of them Democratic governors. And Bashir of Kentucky is one. Obviously, our governor, Josh Shapiro, is one name who we've heard a lot about. Governor Shapiro does a lot of events across the state on a regular basis. We cover them frequently. And it's been interesting to see the national media kind of covering into these sort of community style, ceremonial kind of events that he typically does. But now you're hearing what sounds like a lot like a stump speech or maybe an audition. He has said he hasn't really spoken about. He spoke to the vice president on Sunday. He's confirmed when the news first broke. But he's been sort of demurred, commenting too much more than that. He had been up until today, wasn't confirming that he had submitted paperwork to be considered for vice president, right? So I think today was the first time he didn't deny it. So everyone's sort of picking over every comment that the governor makes. He's being very, as usual, disciplined, staying on message, really not going to give up the game, certainly. But he's going to be part of this big push this weekend across Pennsylvania to express support for the Kamala Harris campaign in Pennsylvania. So we are going to see, we've been a battleground since, this campaign launched what feels like 1,000 years ago now. But I think it's going to make the attention on Pennsylvania even more acute. If Governor Shapiro does get the nod to be the vice presidential choice, it's going to ramp up even more considerably. So I think that's the immediate focus for as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, that the governor is potentially in that mix. Kamala Harris has to make this decision pretty soon, right? That the convention's coming up in a couple of weeks. I've seen some reporting that she's going to make the decision by August 7th, which is not that far away. So it's going to be an intense 2 weeks and probably an intense 100 days. We're almost 100 days out from the election. So it's definitely ramped things up. It's put a lot more focus on us in the short term. And I think it's going to continue, especially if Governor Shapiro becomes the vice presidential nominee.
Besides Governor Shapiro potentially having an involvement, what have other Pennsylvania legislators said about, the president's withdrawal and Vice President Harris being possibly the Democratic pick?
Yeah, I think it depends which side of the aisle you're speaking to. I think Democrats, for the most part, have been very supportive, have had praise for President Biden calling the decision, really the right time, and praising him for making it what they're viewing as a sort of unselfish decision, thinking about the greater good. Republicans have questioned, how this process was handled, that it was rushed, that they should have done a slower process and let more candidates come forward rather than sort of all lining up behind Vice President Harris. So I think there's a kind of an expectation. There's been a lot of support, across the state from the Democratic Party of Pennsylvania has already unanimously endorsed Vice President Harris for president. So I think it's kind of along the party lines, what you would think. It seems like the Republicans are questioning, this hasn't really happened in Pennsylvania so far, but there's been questions raised about how the campaign funds have been transferred from President Biden to Vice President Harris. We'll probably see more questions arising about that in the next few weeks. But I think between now and the convention, there's a lot of question marks about how things are going to work, how they're going to happen. And there's been a lot of criticism of Vice President Harris, kind of along the same lines that there was criticism of President Biden. Like if you were in line with his policies or agreed with him on policy, a lot of the policy positions, she's the vice president on the ticket. So the expectation is that she will, be able to run on some of that. I think what'll be interesting to see is how she deviates or how she changes or shifts her positions away from the president. I don't expect that to be, in any significantly big way, but there's several issues, that she may change her stance, pivot slightly, but I think the vice president choice that she makes is going to inform that as well, and probably going to be part of that decision, like who is going to complement her on these policy issues, and who is going to bring her kind of that balance to the ticket that presidential candidates always look for.
If Governor Josh Shapiro is picked to be vice president, what would he bring to the office?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that political pundits like to talk about this, right? That if you have someone from Pennsylvania, that helps you win Pennsylvania. Well, that is likely true in this case. Governor Shapiro is relatively popular. His poll numbers are pretty high as far as his approval rating with Pennsylvania voters. He doesn't have a lot of national name recognition that maybe some of the other candidates do. Obviously, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who's been in the mix as well, probably a little bit higher profile. But I think he's been using, like I said, these community events where there's a lot of national media. He's been using that to kind of stump somewhat. And I think he's also, he appears frequently on MSNBC as sort of a surrogate for President Biden when he was still at the top of the ticket. So I think, it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. I think, he's really, like I said, been sort of kept things close to the vest. He's not giving anything away. But I think if this were to happen, like I said, it's probably going to be in the next couple of weeks. It's not going to be a long drawn out process just because there isn't time. It's coming up really quickly. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how and if he becomes more involved in the state level campaign, I think, which we're starting to see this weekend, doing some, that's kicking off this massive mobilization push that the Harris campaign's doing. So it's a strange time we're in, politically speaking. And I'm trying to think of, any comparison, and there aren't very many. So we're sort of in uncharted territory here in a lot of ways.
In other election news, the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee announced that it will invest $500,000 into Pennsylvania state Democratic House races as part of a $2.2 million investment in battleground states. Why do they feel like this is necessary?
I think that this is part of their larger spend, trying to focus on state legislatures that, traditionally over the past, election cycles, Democrats have been pretty well trounced at the state legislative level. They haven't done a good job at mobilizing as Republicans have traditionally historically done. And so what they're looking to do is really shore up candidates down ballot, right? So if you've got, people who are excited about a local candidate running for office, it might, they're going to go vote and potentially vote up and down the ticket. So it's kind of almost a reverse coattails in some ways, getting people involved and excited at the local level. And it's traditionally an area where Democrats, like I said, have not done very well. The Republicans have been a lot more strategic about this and have invested a lot more directly, to help state legislative candidates. And so there's a little bit of a new thing in the past couple of election cycles for Democrats. I think they just really want to secure races up and down the ballot, that they want to make sure that, their state house candidates, their state senate candidates have support. And so it's a little fuzzy, I think, because they talk about investing in candidates. It's not always clear what that level of investment means for each individual candidate. We'll probably do some follow up to find out from the candidates, how did this go? How was this useful? But they've had some success with this approach in recent cycles. I'm thinking of Jim Prokopiak was one of their spotlight candidates, right, when they were talking about a special election several months ago. And he was someone that I think benefited from their assistance and kind of their guidance and extra exposure or so in that race. So it'll be interesting to see how this money is kind of spent, how it's appropriated. And I think if it has an impact on some of these House races that are potentially going to be close.
We've been speaking with Kim Lyons, editor of the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, anytime. Happy to be with you.